So let's do a quick review of the evaluation versus IEP team and the roles that they each individually have. We just talked about the evaluation, the role of the individuals in that evaluation team. The most important piece to keep in mind is they are not the group that's determining supports, services, and placement. That's the IEP team role. And the IEP team is there to review all that evaluative data, take it, work that into goals and objectives for that student from there and not before there, to determine what kind of accommodations, modifications, any support services, related services that need to take place. At that point, they are the ones in charge of determining placement. And the other role that IEP teams have is to be part of those annual reviews every year. So again, their roles are a little bit different. The next section of the training that we're going to be talking about is procedural safeguards and also dispute resolution. Now we're going to talk about procedural safeguards. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, and hopefully you are at this point and have gotten lots of information from your school regarding procedural safeguards, when Congress passed Public Law 94142 a very long time ago, which was the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act back in 1975, they included a system of procedural safeguards. And the procedural safeguards serve as the umbrella or security blanket of educational rights and responsibilities for children with disabilities and their parents. So there's a whole bunch of rights that parents can exercise if they need to. And that's what we're going to cover over the next few slides. Here's the list that we're going to be looking at. We will also, included in that list, we're also going to be talking about the dispute resolution process in Rhode Island. So again, there are a lot of things in this that I think you'll be very interested in. When we talk about parental consent, I want you to be very mindful that that always is considered written consent. When you say to someone, yes, you can do this, yes, you can evaluate my child, or yes, you can make that placement change, that's not enough. Written consent is very, very important. And there are certain times when it's required. It's required for the very first evaluations, anytime that initial evaluation has happened for a student. It's included for every single reevaluation. So again, as I've said before, schools cannot go ahead and evaluate your child without your written consent. And your written consent is also required one other time, and that's at the initial provision of special education and related services. So the very first time a student enters a special education process, there will be a form, there will be some sort of documentation that needs to be collected that says, yes, we agree, yes, it's okay for the school department to provide my child with special education supports. It's not required for schools to be able to kind of look at existing data, and it's also, your consent is not required for testing that all kids get. That's just part of every student's academic process. And it's also not required on annual IEPs. You're not consenting for that IEP to be processed. There is no signature line for that. But what happens when a parent doesn't consent? Now, you heard me talk earlier about the evaluation process. What happens? What's the school's responsibility when a parent doesn't want that child evaluated? Well, the same thing happens in this process if the student has been evaluated, and now we get to the end, and the school's sitting down with that parent, and the parent says, I don't want my child in special education. It happens more than you think. And here's where the protections come into place. The parent certainly has the right to refuse special education and not consent and not sign. But schools have a level of responsibility also. So if the parent does not sign consent for those services to be put in place, the school is not considered in violation of providing that student with a free and appropriate public education, or as we call FAPE. So therefore, if that student does start to fail, and the school's got on record that we have evaluated, these are the recommendations, we do think there's more we can do, but the parent has not given us consent to do that, a parent cannot go forward and take legal action against the school and that they haven't provided my child with a free and appropriate public education. And they also cannot develop that IEP. So they can't implement it, they can't develop it until the parent says, yes, I agree to that. Again, this is to protect the student. The same protections go into place. If a district, and I don't think it happens as frequently, but if the district felt very strongly that this student needed those supports, for whatever reason, they could, again, exercise their rights in requesting a family to participate in mediation or even go to due process if necessary. Parents also have the right to examine their child's records. That's part of those procedural safeguards. They have the right to inspect them. We suggest that parents don't just always show up on a doorstep and say, hey, I want to see my child's records, but really make that appointment. Take the time to, give schools the opportunity to get that information and make sure someone's there to meet you to be able to take a look at that information. You also have the right to participate in meetings. You heard me say at the beginning in our last presentation that parents a long time ago we're only being invited to meetings. No one really, if they didn't show up, no one cared. They would just be invited. We could show, yep, we sent the letter, but now there is much more at stake. Schools are required to make sure that families are participating in those meetings. And although that doesn't include like informal discussions between teachers, those decision-making meetings, including IEP evaluations, placement decisions, discipline issues, parents are required to be part of that process. Parents also, in order to be part of that process, have the right to receive notice of those meetings. When families call us and they want some levels of support, some of the first questions we're going to ask them, especially if it's about attending a meeting, is, well, what type of a meeting is it? Did you get a meeting notice? Who's going to be at that meeting? So the notice is a very important part of the process that needs to take place. And most importantly, anytime there's changes in placement, the parents need to be part of that process. We talk about placement as a placement change through the IEP. That's not to be confused with a change of location. Location is different than placement. The same placement that shows up in an IEP could certainly happen in a different classroom, even in a different school. That's a location change. We certainly best practices to make sure that parents are part of that process, but they would should be in part of that process just from the bigger placement standpoint. So, and we looked at this slide regarding parent participation. Again, there's a lot of steps that schools are required to take. They need to make sure that you're getting that letter 10 days prior to that meeting. So we don't want to hear that you're getting a phone call the night before, that morning about a meeting. The law is very specific. That notice needs to go out 10 days prior, and ideally we hope that meeting can be happening at least 10 days prior. But certainly parents can waive that right also. That the schedule is at a mutually agreed upon time. Schools need to make sure that they have a level of flexibility that is going to assure that parent's voice is at the table. That the content of that notice really has the specifics of when, where, how, what's going to be happening at that meeting. One of the examples that I share frequently actually is we had sent one of our new parent mentors out. This was many years ago. We had trained her. She had worked a lot with this family. The parents were a little bit on the adversarial side. And, but this mentor thought that she had gotten everything ready and knew what meeting she was going to. So she thought she was going to a regular IEP meeting. And this was a parent who had really been extremely combative in the other meetings up to this point. So we get to the meeting, or they get to the meeting, and it turns out that the meeting was not an IEP meeting. It was actually a pre-conference for due process hearing. Well, the mentor was totally shocked at that point, and the parent got so angry she tipped a table over. So it becomes such an important piece, although we can chuckle at it now. It wasn't funny at the time, but getting that letter, that mentor making sure, and you as a parent making sure that you are very clear with what you're going to be doing and who's going to be there and what we're going to be talking about at that meeting. Really important part. When we talk about other methods to ensure that parents are participating in that dialogue, you know, with the new world of technology and computers, there's lots of different ways that parents are having involvement in their IEP meetings. One just came up recently, and it was a student. I believe he was a 9-year-old student that came up with the idea. And the mom who had been the primary person participating in this child's IEP meetings had been deployed. And so she wasn't going to be, obviously, be able to be at those meetings. And it was the young man that said, well, why don't we have mom Skype in? She Skypes into us on a weekly basis anyways. And they were able to set it up. The school went out of their way to set it up so that the mom could Skype in, have a voice at that IEP meeting, and really be able to participate. So we're really encouraging and really hearing lots of different stories about how that participation is taking place. Schools can conduct a meeting without a parent, but schools have to have a very clear record of how they've made those attempts. And again, this is for the protection of the student. There are sometimes families out there that are not either able to attend or choose not to attend, but that doesn't stop the school department from making sure that they are doing whatever they can to help support that student. Interpreters, an extremely important piece. Schools are required to provide that interpreters for those families that need it. That's a big piece of parent participation. If that parent is sitting at a meeting and they don't understand what's going on, then it kind of the whole process is really defaulted at that point. I also, just as a side note, when we talk about interpreters, this doesn't fall under this as much as we had a parent that called us again a couple of years back who he was the single parent and was trying to support his teenage daughter, and he really didn't understand that IEP. And he didn't know what to do because they were reading a lot off the IEP. They were reading some things, but they didn't really understand what was going on. So we were talking to him on the phone, and in that process, he disclosed that he could not read, but that he really wanted to make sure that his daughter was able to get what she needed. So we encouraged him to certainly disclose that, have those conversations, making sure that he is understanding, that they're giving him that information at those meetings in a way that he can understand it, so that he can be a more active participant in his meetings for his daughter. And lastly, when we talk about parent participation, again, these are all the little safeguards in place. A parent has the right to receive a copy of their IEP within 10 calendar days. So if you haven't received your copy of your IEP yet, keep this in mind, that is another procedural safeguard. Now we're going to talk about the independent educational evaluation, or as we call it, the IEE. This becomes a really important piece of a parent's rights. Parents have the right to disagree with the school's department's evaluations on the data. They also have the right to receive an independent educational evaluation at the public expense. So what we say to families is, if you are going to disagree, this is another one of those areas that you really do want to put that information in writing. Certainly you could give some explanation of why you disagree with the school department, and schools are required to respond to that within no later than 15 calendar days of the receipt of that request. Again, we go back to that kind of timeline piece. Schools can have to do one of two things. They either have to determine whether they're going to provide that independent evaluation or initiate a due process complaint. Now that becomes an important piece for families to understand, that schools do have those rights too. They have the right to say, you know what, we stand on this evaluation and we believe that it's appropriate. What we hope will happen, if that was to happen, that parents can go back and have more of a dialogue, find more ways to gather more information, really take a look at maybe what else the parent has even brought to the table. But it does become an important right for families. Now, there's only one evaluation for each time that's requested. We can't, the law doesn't provide for that independent educational evaluation to be done, and then a parent to say, oh, I don't like this one either, I want another one. That's not in place. But it is important to know that that is available. Schools are required to give you information as to where you could find that independent evaluator. You can also find them yourself, but schools are required to give you that information. What's most important also to remember about this is the results need to be considered. It doesn't necessarily mean that the results need to be implemented. And that is an important note, that when you're having those conversations, that when you're working with schools, that you're trying to find that common area. You are certainly looking at what's best. Hopefully everyone's looking at what's best for that student. But be mindful that that schools do not have to just automatically implement everything that an outside evaluation has put in place. Prior written notice is another important piece of this process, of your rights. And what that states is prior written notice needs to be put in place 10 days before a proposal or refusal to initiate or change identification, evaluation, or placement of a student. Meaning that when we finish doing that IEP, and it's said and done and we're ready to put it in place, the school is required to say, okay, mom, dad, you have 10 days. If you're not in agreement with this, we're putting it in place. So it gives the 10 days for parents to either take an action at that point. Now, parents can also waive that right of before it's implemented and be able to say, no, we're good with this. I want to sign to waive. We can get this started on Monday. I don't need my 10-day notice. But that 10 days is a very important piece that is in place. And in that notice, it should give you information about, so what's going to be happening. The IEP is going to be implemented, or we're going to evaluate, or we're going to change a placement. But it certainly has to have an explanation of the action and why that action is taking place. It may also include a description of the evaluation procedures and assessments that have been used to make those decisions. It needs to include those procedural safeguards, all the things that we're talking about right now. And also a source of information as to where parents can get more information to help them understand what's going on in this process. And in most cases, that's giving them information about RIPIN. It also needs to be in language they can understand. So that becomes a really important piece for families to understand, okay, what's happening? Why is this happening? When is it happening? And if it doesn't happen, or if I don't want it to happen, what kind of things can I do in order to stop this, or at least slow it down? We certainly encourage families. Usually at this point somebody will ask me, okay, what if I, I'm not happy with that IEP? We encourage families to set up another meeting at that point. If we need to discuss more about, maybe there's more data that needs to be gathered, have those conversations. Certainly if mediation is required, which we'll talk about a little bit later. If you're feeling like you need someone from the outside to kind of help you guys move this forward, mediation is a great opportunity to do that. But what we don't want to see parents do is just kind of put it on the counter, forget about it, because in 10 days, school's going to be able to implement that process. As part of the procedural safeguards, schools are required to make sure you have your procedural safeguards, that you do need to have this information handy. In past years, the joke has always been that procedural safeguards, which is this very large document with all these rights and responsibilities in it, used to be printed out on a two-sided piece of paper with font size that no one could read. And they were handed out every time you walk down a hallway. Schools don't need to do that anymore. There's a lot of benefits to this. They do need to provide families with the information at least once a year. They can provide it in a number of different ways, though. They can have it available on a website. They can email that information. Certainly every time a parent requests those procedural safeguards, they need to be given out. Certainly at the initial referral to special education. There's a lot of ways that schools are required to make sure that parents understand what their rights are. We work closely with the Rhode Island Department of Education. This information we're sharing back and forth all the time. And they understand the importance of parents really needing to know this in order to make informed decisions. So we've talked about so far a lot of the procedural safeguards that we have in place. We're now going to move into more of those, but really specifically around the dispute resolution process. So what happens when parents and schools disagree?